When we think about the antagonist in the Bible, it's quite easy to simply think of Satan, God's eternal nemesis, and one of the chief representations of evil in Christianity. And yet, there exists an entity within the Bible that some may consider just as sinister as Satan, if not more so. They call him Abaddon, and he is often referred to as the Angel of Death. Abaddon's presence in the Bible is quite minimal, given that he is mentioned only 6 times in the Old Testament and once more in the New Testament, although his mentions are often ambiguous and maintain multiple perspectives, as well as being open to scholarly interpretation. Abaddon isn't just noted as being an angelic being, however, but is also a place of destruction equivocal to hell or the underworld. In fact, the very first reference of Abaddon is in the form of this realm of suffering, where the biblical character Job states in Job 26:6, "Sheol is naked before God, and Abaddon has no covering." In this part of Job's story, we see that Job, who has lost his family, his home, and his livelihood, is arguing with his friends, given that they don't seem to quite offer the empathy that he might have expected. Instead, his friends tell him that he probably deserved his fate, because God wouldn't have plagued him so without good reason. They also begin to question Job's understanding of God, essentially telling him that he, a mere man, could not comprehend that of which God intends. But Job rebukes this and talks about God's amazing abilities so as to demonstrate his own understanding of how God works. He speaks of the Sheol, a place of darkness in the Old Testament, where dead souls go, and that it lies naked before God, implying that God sees everything in every realm. The mentioning of Abaddon having no covering implies that God is aware of all of the destruction that goes on in the realms, and that there is no amount of destruction that can catch him off guard, thus showing that Job understands how powerful God is just as much as his friends claim to. Other interpretations see Abaddon referred to as a being, and that he has no covering, or no means to hide from God, and that his destructive nature does not go unnoticed. Abaddon is again referenced as a place by Job in chapter 28, where Job is still speaking to his friends, only now he tells them of the impossibility of man finding divine wisdom, or any wisdom for that matter. He rants about wisdom not being able to be purchased by all the gold in the world, and that both the land and the sea do not claim ownership of it. He also claims that wisdom cannot be matched by any metal in the world, and that it hides from the eyes of the living. In 28:21, Job states that wisdom is hard to come by, that both Abaddon and Death say, "We have heard rumour of it with our ears." Given that the land and the sea are mentioned in Job 28:14 as not claiming wisdom, we can assume that Job is personifying earthly features. Therefore, it can be argued that he's also doing the same with Abaddon, as a feature or a place, and that the realm of destruction itself does not claim to have wisdom. However, because Abaddon is being personified in the first place and is used in conjunction with Death, there are those that believe that Abaddon is an actual being, one who is powerful enough to be comparable to Death. By chapter 31, Job is desperate to prove that he did not deserve the fate that had befallen him. He makes a series of declarations before God and man that if he is guilty, then he will gladly suffer an even worse fate. In chapter 31, 9-12, Job declares that if his sins revolve around adultery, then God should have his wife search for another man, and that though such a punishment would greatly hurt him, he would bear the brunt of it, though he knows full well he is innocent of such a crime. In this verse, he describes his punishment as being equal to being scorched by the fires that rage as far as Abaddon. Again, we may interpret this as a reference to a place, or simply hell itself, in that there is no fire as hot as hell, and so exemplifies the severity of the punishment. Abaddon is mentioned in another text, the book of Psalms, more specifically Psalm 88, which is a bleak hymn said to be associated with death or sickness. In this psalm, it's said in 88:11, "Shall thy loving kindness be declared in the grave of tiny faithlessness in Abaddon?" The writer is essentially expostulating with God, demanding to know if in his sickness he will be shown kindness in the grave, or if he will meet suffering at the hands of Abaddon for his sins. Again, it's clear to see that Abaddon in this psalm is being used as a spiritual location, a representation of hell itself. Proverbs 15:11 also speaks of Abaddon, and like Job, the proverb seeks to show us that God sees all in the realms, for it states, "Sheol and Abaddon are before the Lord," which once again demonstrates Abaddon is a place in that mortals might not be able to perceive, but that God certainly can. Proverb 27:20 also speaks of Abaddon, and is the final mention of the being or place in the Old Testament. In a particularly favourite biblical quote of mine, it's noted that Sheol and Abaddon are never satisfied, and never satisfied are the eyes of man. Essentially, what this is trying to teach us is that Abaddon, or hell, will always exist, because man will always sin, and therefore will always have a place. It also shows us that man can never be content with what he has, and that his search for more is what can lead him down the path of sin, as greater rewards and thrills require greater sacrifices. Finally, in the New Testament, it's here we see Abaddon explicitly mentioned as an actual entity, an angel of death, if you will. In the book of Revelations 9:1-11, John has a vision of the end times, where demonic horsemen are seen rising from a newly opened abyss. These demons have a ruler, a so-called king, who goes by the name Abaddon. In Greek, it translates to Apollyon, but both words have the same meaning, destroyer or destruction. John's vision comes after the opening of the 7 seals, and that there in heaven it is declared that 144,000 people from the tribes of Israel would be spared from God's destruction. 7 angels then prepare to blow on their trumpets, and a series of calamities befall Earth, including hellfire, meteors, and a falling star known simply as wormwood. Some interpretations of this falling star indicate that this is the fallen angel Lucifer, cast out of heaven, but others believe that this was a literal star that had been fired upon Earth by one of the 7 angels in John's vision. When the 5th angel blew his trumpet, either another star fell from the sky, or the star wormwood that had already fallen is given a key to the abyss. Here the star is suddenly personified, and in Revelation 9:2, John states, "He opened the abyss, and smoke rose from it, like the smoke from a gigantic furnace." John carries on his description of the abyss in Revelation 9:3-11, as locusts emerge with the sting of scorpions. However, they are told not to harm animals or plants, but only humans. Specifically, not the 144,000 people who were mocked in Israel. Everyone else, though, was fair game, and they received suffering and torture at the hands of these locusts. By Revelations 9:11, he states that the locusts had a king over them, the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew was Abaddon, the destroyer. There is some debate, however, as to whether Abaddon in this instance is a source of evil, or if he is an extension of God, or at least an evil in which God has created to serve him. Given that Abaddon is produced by the 5th angel who blew his trumpet, and was given the key to the abyss in the first place, it's safe to say that Abaddon is not necessarily a demon, so to speak, but indeed an agent of death, commissioned by God to do his bidding. Others see Abaddon as merely an interpretation of Satan, and that God had his angels open the abyss that was hell, allowing for Satan and his demons to decimate and torture man, who had sinned. By this view, Satan or Abaddon is inadvertently doing God's bidding because of his thirst to inflict harm upon others. Meanwhile, there exists another view that Abaddon is a minion of Satan, and that he is under the influence of the devil than of God. There even exist ideas that Abaddon is another name for Jesus, who as a representative of God comes to implement the destruction of the world in the end times. According to Gnostic texts, which are a set of 52 texts discovered in Egypt that claim to have secret teachings of Jesus, Abaddon plays a more important role. While the Gnostic texts are not necessarily biblical, I thought it would be interesting to show another perspective of what the ancient authors perceived. In these texts, Abaddon appears in a homily which is titled The Enthronement of Abaddon, and then again in the Apocalypse of Bartholomew. In the Enthronement of Abaddon, he is first referred to as Muriel, and had been given the task of collecting the earth that God would use to create Adam. Once Adam was created, Abaddon would become his guardian, a guardian who all the angels and demons feared. It's also noted that Abaddon served as a conduit between man and God at some point, according to the Gnostic text, which tells that Abaddon ferried souls back and forth. He is also noted as being present in the tomb that Jesus was resurrected in the Apocalypse of Bartholomew. While Abaddon is certainly a controversial figure who has roots in both Judaism and Christianity, he certainly leaves an impression when you really think about his role. In a more generally agreed version, he is summoned by God to torture those who had strayed from the path of righteousness. Remember, he was given strict orders by the Almighty not to kill man, but to make man suffer. As Revelation 9:5 reads, Abaddon and his locusts were not allowed to kill them, but only to torture them for 5 months, and the agony they suffered was like that of the sting of a scorpion when it strikes. But do let me know in the comments below what you think about Abaddon, the so-called angel of death and destruction. And as always, if you've enjoyed today's video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Until the next time, guys.